Hello, everyone, and welcome to your second week of narratives of the Old Testament. And I want to emphasize that I'm talking about narratives. That's why you have the definitions assignment this coming week, because we are looking at literature. And while the Bible, for Christians especially, is a book that we consider authoritative and trustworthy as a guide for our lives as Christians. It's also literature, and understanding how to interpret or look at a particular genre of literature is important in understanding its meaning. So that's why we're looking at particular narratives. Story doesn't mean it's a fable or it's fantasy. It simply means it's a story. You can tell a story about your family and its journey, and that story is just as true as a story that somebody else tells about their family. So this week you're going to be looking at the stories that Christians have, along with Jews, have held to be true, that God created the world, that human beings made fateful decisions that have affected our destiny, our history. And you're going to be reading about Abraham, the father of the Jewish race, venerated by Muslims and appreciated by Christians as well. The great three monotheistic religions all hold Abraham in high esteem. You will note that your definitions assignment is a little bit more tricky than the other written assignments that you have. You will have to look in different places to find the meaning of the words in that list. And I expect you to do that other than Wikipedia. Please do not use Wikipedia. You can find other sources. I have given you a couple of sources to start with, and you may have to go beyond that. Please include your citations where you got your information. And the reason I want you to understand, there are some terms there, and then there are some literary terms. The terms that you will need to understand are part of the study of the Bible, things like Septuagint, canon. That's not a cannon that we send out cannonballs from. These things are important as you wrestle with and come to understand the Bible, especially the Old Testament in this case. Then you have some literary terms, and especially I want you to think in terms of the metaphor, the simile. These are comparisons. These are very important ways of conveying stories. And the difficulty with metaphor is that sometimes we cannot get to an exact literal understanding of what the metaphor is, because that is a metaphor. When I say, for example, the Lord is a rock, that doesn't mean that God is literally a rock, but it conveys that's how solid the rock is, how permanent a rock is. Those are the characteristics that we ascribe to God. And so the scripture often uses metaphors to help us understand what God is like or what a particular experience is like. And it's important to understand genre in our study of the Old Testament, because it will help us understand how do we interpret what it says. Poetry, for example, is not propositional statements, as you find, for example, in mathematics. Poetry is building an image, a picture in our minds. It's more sensory. Narratives are sometimes straightforward, linear stories, but often they're not. Often they're circular in their approach. And in fact, in the Old Testament, you'll find a lot of repetition. Somebody will tell the story and then they'll go on and they'll say it again. And so that tells us that there's something important going on there when a story is repeated. All of this does not take away from or minimize the truth, the validity, the authority of Scripture. For those of us who are Christians, we consider the Old Testament just as authoritative for our lives as the New Testament about the person of Jesus. However, that doesn't mean that we can't understand it just a little bit differently than when we think of in terms of literal understanding of the Scripture. The story about creation, in your reading, you will discover that creation in the Hebrew concept of creation is very, very different from the other Eastern civilizations and their understanding of creation. And the question we have to keep asking ourselves, where did they get that idea, which was very unique to the Hebrews? That and you'll see that as you read the stories about creation. The question where in Abraham, when you come to Abraham, the question that intrigues me often is that Abraham was born and raised in a very polytheistic society and civilization, and yet he came to believe in only one God. How did that happen? What is it that Abraham discovered? How did he discover it? And this is what I find truly fascinating about the Old Testament. It doesn't tell us everything. We are not required to fill in the gaps. We are not required to make up stuff that we don't know. We take it and we think about it. What is God conveying to us through these stories? Because once again, let me remind you that the Old Testament is about the way God relates to human beings and how he reveals himself, the kind of God that he is. So every story that we read, we have to ask ourselves, what is God showing us here about himself? The fact that a story is in the Old Testament or in the Bible does not mean that God condones or approves or says this is the way you should do things. There are stories that we come across and we think that's terrible. But that's why it's such a rich book of and a literary work, because the Bible tells us about human experience. We identify with human experience. We identify with the anger. We identify with the love. We identify with the hardship. We identify with the struggle. We identify with moments of clarity. We identify with so many of the parts of the story that we're going to come across. So as you read, not only I'm not just thinking of asking you to have an open mind, but I'm trying to get you to understand that there may be different ways of looking at the scripture than what you have been taught or what you've always believed. And those different ways don't mean that we are minimizing the importance or taking away from the authority. The scripture has to be taken on its own worth and its own, as it's written, not in the way we interpret it necessarily. And of course, we are that's what literature is about. We interpret it, but let's try to understand it first in its context. So you'll read about creation. It is not necessary to understand the 6 days of creation in a literal sense, although some people do. There are other views of creation. Creation does not mean that we don't believe in science. The Bible talks about life and talks about where we get the meaning of our life from. Science was never intended to tell us where we find meaning in life. Science discovers lots of things, and science is the gift that God has given to us. But science doesn't give us meaning. It's what we discover in the human experience as expressed through the scripture as God revealed himself to a particular people in the world, in history. He revealed himself to Abraham, and he made promises to Abraham. I will make you a great nation so that you can bless, so that you can be a blessing to all people. It's not just about this group of people, it's about being a blessing to other people. And then the other promise, I will give you land. I will make you a great nation. I will make you a blessing to all people, and I will give you a land of your own. Those were the promises that God made to Abraham. And we will trace those promises as we follow the creation of the Hebrew nation and its journey through its own particular history in the Old Testament. So, any questions? Be sure and send me an email. Let me know if you're struggling with anything. Keep up the work. You're beginning to get your feet wet in the things, and some things you may find troubling, some things you may be wrestling with, and that's good. That's what this is about. So I look forward to reading your work this week and your comments in forum posts, and I will be posting my own observations of your forum discussions uh, later in the week. So have a good week. Enjoy the journey. Talk to you later.